I ran it like a business, because that's what it was. That line, attributed to the mind behind one of the most disciplined criminal enterprises New York City has ever seen, raises a question that should disturb anyone willing to sit with it honestly. What happens when a person with genuine organizational intelligence, the kind of mind that in a different zip code might have run a logistics firm or managed a Fortune 500 supply chain, instead pours every ounce of that talent into the crack cocaine economy? What does it cost a community when brilliance meets desperation? And what does it cost the person themselves? To understand Gerald Prince Miller, you have to understand the ground he stood on. South Jamaica, Queens, in the early 1980s, was not the bottom of New York City. That was the complicated part. It was a working-class neighborhood, a place where families owned homes, parents held transit jobs, and children walked to schools with names that honored jazz legends. The houses on the residential blocks around Guy R. Brewer Boulevard were modest but dignified. Church attendance was real. Block parties still happened. But threaded through that fabric, like a wire pulled tight, were the Baisley Park Houses, a sprawling public housing development that sat like a world within a world. Thousands of families lived inside those red brick towers. And by 1984, when crack cocaine first began to seep into the streets of southeast Queens, the distance between the houses on the hill and the towers in the flats might as well have been measured in light years. Gerald Miller was born into the space between those two realities. His uncle, Kenneth Supreme McGriff, only 2 years older, close enough in age that the two boys grew up more like brothers, came from a stable two-parent household. McGriff's father was a military man, disciplined and strict. Both parents worked for New York City's transit system. There was nothing in their upbringing that demanded they become what they became. But South Jamaica in the late 1970s offered its young men a fork in the road that was becoming impossibly stark. On one side, school, a city job, a slow climb. On the other, the streets, which promised velocity. McGriff and Miller chose velocity. They found the 5% Nation together, a spiritual and intellectual movement born out of the Nation of Islam that taught its adherents they were part of a chosen 5% meant to lead and enlighten. It gave them language, identity, structure, and brotherhood. It also gave them a coded communication system that would later make them nearly impossible for law enforcement to understand. By the early 1980s, McGriff had organized a loose group of 5%er teenagers from in and around the Baisley Park Houses into something he called the Supreme Team. What began as a neighborhood crew quickly became something else entirely. McGriff was the visionary, the man with the charisma and the relationships. He connected with established drug figures in Queens, plugged into Colombian cocaine suppliers through Latino members of his crew, and established the team's territory in and around the projects. Miller, meanwhile, was the operational mind, the enforcer, the disciplinarian, the one who made the machine run. He was quiet where McGriff was magnetic. He was precise where McGriff was expansive. Together, they were devastating. What made the Supreme Team different from the dozens of other crack crews operating across New York in the mid-1980s was not simply its volume of sales, though that was staggering. At its peak in 1987, the organization was generating over $200,000 a day, moving roughly 25,000 vials of crack per week out of Baisley Park alone. What made it different was its architecture. The Supreme Team operated with layers of insulation that federal prosecutors would later compare to the structure of a traditional organized crime family. Street-level sellers never interacted with Miller or McGriff. Money was collected and funneled upward through crew managers. Cocaine was purchased at the kilogram level from Colombian connections and processed into crack at designated apartments, then packaged and distributed to individual sales spots, each run by a supervisor with his own crew beneath him. Miller deployed armed sentinels on the rooftops of the Baisley Park towers, equipped with two-way radios, scanning for police. When officers entered the area, the radio network triggered an instant shutdown. Dealers vanished, product disappeared, evidence evaporated. The NYPD would arrive to find nothing but brick walls and silence. And then there was the language. Supreme team members communicated using the supreme alphabet and supreme mathematics of the 5% nation, a coded system of letters and numbers that corresponded to concepts and phrases outsiders could not decipher. Wiretaps picked up conversations that sounded like theological discussions. Surveillance transcripts read like philosophy seminars. For investigators trying to build cases using intercepted communications, it was like trying to prosecute men speaking in tongues. This was not a drug corner. This was an institution. What fed the mythology, and the danger, was the way the Supreme Team existed simultaneously in the worlds of commerce, culture, and violence. McGriff threw lavish parties in Queens, booking early hip-hop acts. He paid artists like LL Cool J and others $1,000 a night to perform at events that functioned as both celebrations and demonstrations of power. The Supreme Team became neighborhood celebrities. Children in Baisley Park received turkey dinners at Thanksgiving. Families had their bills paid. Kids were taken on trips to amusement parks. The organization presented itself as a benefactor, and in a community starved of resources, many residents accepted the arrangement without asking where the money came from. The line between community hero and criminal enterprise was not merely blurred in South Jamaica. It was erased. But beneath that public generosity lay an enforcement apparatus of extraordinary ruthlessness. When McGriff was arrested on state narcotics charges in 1985 and eventually sent to prison in 1987, Gerald Miller assumed full control of the Supreme Team, and his leadership revealed a psychology that had always been present, but now had no counterweight. Miller expanded the security force. He turned it inward. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was tested. Members suspected of disloyalty were dealt with through violence. Rivals were eliminated. In 1987 alone, according to federal court records, Miller and the incarcerated McGriff ordered at least 8 homicides. The bodies were not incidental. They were structural. Each killing served a purpose within the organization: to seal a territory, silence a witness, remove a competitor, or discipline a member who had stepped outside the rules. Miller did not see these acts as chaos. He saw them as management. The first major crack in the wall came in late 1987. While Miller was incarcerated on state charges of his own, a joint task force of NYPD officers and FBI agents executed search warrants across multiple Supreme Team locations, storage sites, drug outlets, residences. Someone had tipped the organization off shortly before the raids. The team managed to move 11 kilograms of cocaine and $200,000 in cash before agents arrived. But the raids still disrupted operations. Key members were arrested. Supply lines were severed. For the first time, the machine sputtered. And then Miller came home. In the spring of 1989, released from state custody, he set about rebuilding. The reorganized Supreme Team was leaner but no less disciplined. Miller installed Wilfredo C. Justice Arroyo as his second-in-command. Harry Hunt served as his personal bodyguard. Ernesto Piniella ran security. Ronald Tucker and Waverly Coleman managed retail spots and supervised crews. David Robinson helped oversee drug operations and, critically, kept records. Raymond Robinson handled cocaine purchases, oversaw the processing of powder into crack, and delivered finished product to sales locations. The operation ran out of Robinson's mother's apartment in Baisley Park, where cash was counted, cocaine was cooked, and phone calls to Colombian suppliers were made on a near-daily basis. But the second incarnation of the Supreme Team carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The violence that had always been a tool of organizational discipline began to escalate beyond control. In the summer of 1989, the team decided to rob rather than pay its Colombian suppliers. 4 traffickers, 2 known only as Fernando and George, their full identities never confirmed, were lured to a location and killed. Their bodies were never identified. A former associate named Rivera, deemed a liability, was shot in the head in a Baisley Park courtyard. He survived. The team tracked him to a motel in South Jamaica through threats against his girlfriend and killed him there. 2 more Colombian suppliers, Fernando Suarez and Pablo Perlaza, were bound, robbed, and murdered. The violence was no longer strategic. It was becoming reflexive. What Miller could not see, what men in his position almost never see, is that the very sophistication that protected the organization was also producing the evidence that would bury it. The records David Robinson kept were meticulous. The wiretaps the state had been running since late 1989 were capturing everything. What Miller could not see, what men in his position almost never see, is that the very sophistication that protected the organization was also producing the evidence that would bury it. The records David Robinson kept were meticulous. The wiretaps the state had been running since late 1989 were capturing everything. In March 1990, the federal government brought the hammer down. Gerald Miller was charged with multiple offenses connected to his leadership of the Supreme Team. The indictment was built on the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, the same statute designed to dismantle the mafia. Prosecutors did not charge Miller as a drug dealer. They charged him as the leader of a criminal enterprise. The distinction was everything. Under RICO, the government did not need to prove that Miller had personally sold a single vial of crack. They needed to prove he had directed, managed, and benefited from an ongoing pattern of criminal activity, and the evidence was overwhelming. The trial revealed the full scope of what the Supreme Team had been. Prosecutors presented testimony from former members who described the organizational chart, the promotion structure, the enforcement protocols, the coded communications. They introduced wiretap transcripts from the period between December 1989 and March 1990 that captured Miller negotiating cocaine purchases by phone with William Graham, a supplier with Colombian connections. They traced the money, cash deliveries to the Robinson apartment, kilogram-level purchases, the processing and distribution pipeline. They documented the murders. Local detectives testified that since Miller's arrest, homicides in the area had dropped by more than 30%. The implication was not subtle. One man's removal from the streets had measurably reduced the killing. Miller was convicted on multiple counts, including RICO racketeering and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The sentence was severe. Decades in federal custody, handed down by Judge Raymond Deary of the Eastern District of New York. At sentencing, Judge Deary reportedly spoke directly to Miller about the waste of talent his case represented. It was the kind of remark that sounds like a cliché until you look at the organizational architecture Miller had built and realize the judge was not being generous. He was being accurate. The Supreme Team had operated with a level of structural discipline that most legitimate businesses never achieve. The hierarchy was clear. The roles were defined. The communication systems were proprietary. The security protocols were sophisticated enough to withstand years of law enforcement pressure. And all of it had been built by a man who was barely in his 20s. The aftermath consumed everyone it touched. Over 110 Supreme Team members were arrested and convicted in the early 1990s. Kenneth McGriff, after his own release and return to criminal activity, was eventually convicted in 2007 of racketeering, murder for hire, narcotics trafficking, and illegal financial transactions. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Baisley Park Houses remained, as they had always been, home to thousands of families who had no part in any of it. Families who had lived under the shadow of the Supreme Team and now lived with its ghost. The neighborhood was quieter after the arrests. But quieter is not the same as healed. The Supreme Team's influence outlived its existence. Its organizational model, the layered insulation, the coded communications, the community engagement as a cover for criminal enterprise, the merger of street culture and economic infrastructure, became a template that drug organizations across the country studied and attempted to replicate throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. Its entanglement with hip-hop culture, particularly the Queens scene that produced some of rap's most significant voices, meant that the mythology of the Supreme Team was embedded in lyrics, referenced in films, and preserved in a cultural memory that often stripped the violence of its consequences. The rapper 50 Cent, who had once worked the streets of Queens, would later reference the Supreme Team in a track that named both Miller and McGriff. A song that reportedly infuriated both men, because it turned their real lives into entertainment without permission. Gerald Miller served over 3 decades in federal prison. In September 2024, at the age of 59, he was released by order of U.S. District Judge Nicholas Garofis. In a letter to the court, Miller credited Judge Deary's sentencing remarks from decades earlier with sparking his transformation. He had spent the intervening years pursuing education, mentoring younger inmates, and preparing for a life of advocacy. Upon release, he founded an organization dedicated to steering young people away from the cycles that had consumed him. Whether his redemption is genuine, whether decades behind bars can transmute the mind that built the Supreme Team into something that heals rather than destroys, is a question only time and sustained action can answer. But the deeper question, the one this story asks from its opening breath, remains. What happens when genuine organizational intelligence meets an economy built on despair? The crack epidemic did not create Gerald Miller's mind. It captured it. South Jamaica did not lack talent. It lacked pathways. And the Supreme Team, for all its discipline and structure, for all the turkey dinners and amusement park trips, was finally just a machine for converting human potential into product, money, and graves. The blueprint Miller built was brilliant, and it was a catastrophe. Those two truths do not cancel each other out. They sit together, side by side, like the houses on the hill and the towers in the flats, close enough to touch, and a world apart.